2 minutes and then we'll start.
And then Gianfranco goes first, and then I go after Gianfranco and introduce our two speakers, and then we take it from there. Very good.
Correct.
So tell me again, it's about 7 minutes that you want us to talk before on the topic. Did you say 7 minutes before?
We say 5 minutes. 5 minutes
Five
each,
minutes, okay.
you and the 5
5
minutes Ken. And then after Albertino will start with the program.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. How is in Mantova? Is it warm, Stefano?
It's seasonal. I would say it's about 10, 12 degrees, the maximum.
Okay. Here today is very cold. And our governor said that Monday they're going to close the indoor dining. So it's going to be only outdoor. And today we are in the 36, 38. So getting cold. But we are New Yorker. So we are receiving.
We have survived so much.
Eskimos and overcoats and gloves. You know, it's very difficult to handle a fork and a knife with gloves. You know?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we can start anyway. Good afternoon and welcome to the 11 Italian Table Talks, Faith, Food and Fasting, How Religion Shapes Culinary Tradition. My name is Gianfranco Sorrentino. I am the managing partner of Il Gattopardo Group, and I am also the president of Gruppo Italiano, a not-for-profit organization that promote the Italian culinary culture here in the United States. First, let me thank Elise Lee, founder of Fill-In, for the technical support. I have also to thank my wife, Paola Bolla Sorrentino, and David Ernst, who produced this event today. And let me welcome our friends from Italy that are following us from Italy. In Italy now is 9 o'clock, it's just before dinner. So they're going to follow our webinar. So they're going to have an open stomach and they will enjoy their dinner. Anyway, in the previous webinars, we have been talking mainly about the product, the producer, restaurant, about the PPP federal funds, and the other trade important topics. But today we wanted to shift the focus a little bit to the culture of food and faith. Faith plays a significant role in forming a personal identity. It can shape and influence our culture, our thinking, and can also dictate how and what we eat. Today's webinar highlights the explored impact of that symbolic religious event, historic periods, and the religious tradition have on the way we eat. I was born a Catholic, I grew up Catholic, but later in the last 40 years, I go to church only for weddings and unfortunately funerals. But let me say strictly from a foodie point of view that I love the Catholic feast. You go out, you eat a lot, you drink a lot, you spend time with the family and friends. From a restaurateur point of view, I never really understood the Muslim Ramadan. Can you imagine 30 days of fasting? We'll be out of business. And what about the Jewish holidays? Nobody goes out and the Jewish people have to stay home and feast. Of course, I am kidding, but you can see the importance of religion on diet and culinary tradition. Now let me introduce the panelists and the moderator. Our panelists, we have Professor Luigi Ballerini and Ken Albala, expert on those topics area to guide us through the understanding of the relationship between faith and food. Luigi is a writer, poet, translator, a former head of professor of Italian studies at both New York University and the UCLA. Ken Albala is a professor of history at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. And we had Professor Albala before at the Italian Table Talk on the ancient grain. We also have a great moderator. our good friend and supporter Stefano Albertini, professor of Italian at the New York University and director of Casa Italiana Zerilli Manimo. Also, let me take a moment to congratulate Director Albertini. He was recently honored as the Alumnus of the Year 2020 for the University of Parma. Deserved honor. Congratulations. Stefano, is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianfranco. And yes, and just mentioning Parma, of course, the immediate association is with food. And for all of my life, when people ask me, where did you graduate from? I say, University of Parma, better known for Parmigiano Reggiano and Prosciutto di Parma. But the university is not bad either. So I was very pleased to be recognized by the rector and the colleagues as alumnus of the year. And the topic is fascinating. I'm neither an expert in religion, strictly speaking, even if I spent part of my time at the University of Parma studying church history and food, but I'm a great lover of food, and I've undertaken many cultural ventures that have to do with food, many of which with Gianfranco in his several incarnations with the different groups that he has led and organized to educate people to a better understanding of food, and in particular, but not only of Italian food. And I'm fascinated by the connection. Just to give you a sense, I'm from Mantova, from a small town called Bozzolo. It means cocoon, literally. It's in the province of Mantova. And we have a dish that right now everybody's preparing in their homes. That is tortelli di zucca. People, when they think of Mantova and what we eat, they normally think of tortelli di zucca. They don't know that we basically eat them once a year, and that's for Christmas Eve. And basically each household has its different recipe, and it's the source of endless discussions, whether you should put the mostarda di Cremona in it, or quella di Mantova, whether it should be apples only, pears only, or a mixed mostarda would do. Amaretti, do you put the amaretti only inside or also crumble them outside? But all of that is also condito, dressed with deep theological discussions regarding the way in which you serve them. And in certain parts of the province of Mantova, tortelli di zucca are served only with melted butter and sage. That's it. In other parts of the province of Mantua, they're served with a tomato sauce enriched by bacon, pancetta. So it's a sort of a matriciana. To me, that doesn't make any sense. But if you scratch a bit behind the surface, you realize that that tradition of adding slices of bacon and tomato to the dressing of the tortelli di zucca that are already a weird mixture of flavors and tastes has to do with religion. And it's sort of identified the area of the province in which tortelli are eaten in that way with the most anti-clerical part of the province of Mantua, the part of the province that tends to go towards Emilia. As you know, Mantua is like a triangle between Veneto in the north and Emilia in the south. And traditionally, Emilia has always been the red region, and not for the use of tomato, but for their political persuasion. So the fact is that on Christmas Eve, when everybody eats tortelli di zucca, it's inconceivable not to eat them, whether you're an atheist, a communist, a fascist, whatever, you eat tortelli di zucca. But you can make a statement as the fact that you are not really respecting the abstinence from meat that is prescribed on the eve of holy days of obligation, or used to be prescribed before the Second Vatican Council. And therefore, your pancetta on the tortelli di zucca is a religious statement, or if you wish, an anti-religious statement. And these two is the source still now of endless discussions. And I'm pretty sure in the coming days in the Gazzetta di Mantova, that is the oldest daily newspaper in Italy, to which I also collaborate, there is going to be the usual diatribe of Christmas, whether to put pancetta or not. But that too has a religion origin. And with this anecdote, I just wanted to say how rooted the culture of food and the culture of religion are, and how mixed they are. And it's never indifferent. Food and religion always go together, whether it's to make a statement pro or against it. And this is my introduction to the topic, but I'm really looking forward to listen to what Professor Ballerini and Professor Albala have to say. I think we start with Professor Ballerini. Gianfranco has already introduced him. I only want to add that he is also my venerable predecessor as first director of Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò. I refer to him as the popes refer to the previous popes. So my venerable predecessor, the floor is all yours.
Unworthy of his successor, of course. Well, I think I will concentrate on a particular year of the European history, 1417, because something very strange happened there and then, namely the conclusion of an ecumenical council called together by Emperor Sigismundus to put an end to the schism that had originated within the church, which had seen for a while the nomination of three different popes. There were three popes. One was called Pope, the other two were called anti-popes, but there were three of them. And it was very difficult for the religious flock to understand what to do. So eventually, the emperor called together this ecumenical council, and one new pope was elected, the other one was asked to withdraw. And one of the first acts that Martin V, it was the day of Saint Martin, that's why I chose that name, did was the hiring of a cook. In fact, we have a document, and Master Johann von Bockenheim signed in and swore allegiance to the Pope. But the same year, 1417, a new translation of the Aristotle's ethics and Nicomachean ethics came into being, and finally it was possible to understand what Aristotle had said and meant at the same time. And all of these elements combined into a new definition of pleasure. The definition of pleasure that given by Aristotle and Lucretius are clearly very new, and they are, in a sense, points of attraction. You need pleasure in order to do things. Pleasure becomes acceptable, and of course, if Aristotle says that it is acceptable, it must be accepted, because Aristotle, as Dante reminds us, is the maestro di coloro che sanno, and the church had built its entire theological construct on the logic and ethics of Aristotle. So that year, of course, things don't happen overnight, but so that year is a pivotal year. There is a before and an after 1417. Prior to that, the notion of pleasure, and of course gastronomic pleasure, is really looked down upon, and we have hundreds of essays on the contempt of pleasure, on the contempt of the world, etc., etc. And after, slowly but surely, given the great work performed by the Florentine humanists, pleasure becomes a Christianized notion. There is a Christianization of epicure. And in fact, you have throughout the 1400s, humanists like Lorenzo Valla or Platina and many others, and who are working on that notion. There is a transformation of the figure of Epicure that had been so badly treated in the Middle Ages without knowing anything about him. You know, it was just there, and he was received a great deal of bad publicity, including Dante, of course, who puts him in hell because he's convinced that Epicure is a person who handles the soul of human beings as if it were the soul of an animal. Che l'anima col corpo morta fanno. So there is a great shift. And of course, gastronomy and eating well is the area where pleasure is applied, because after all, you have to eat. If you don't eat, you die. And so while you're at it, why not eat well? And why not turn the figure of the chef, of the cook, into one of the great characters of the Renaissance? There are many, many humanists who apply their wits to celebrate the art of cooking. Sperone Speroni, Platina himself, and so on. So basically, the cook becomes a hero alongside the courtier, alongside the condottiere, alongside the humanist himself, etc., etc. I think my 5 minutes are over, but I wanted to make that point, and then maybe we can return to it.
Okay, I
Thank
assume
you,
I'm
Luigi.
next.
Professor Albal, I think we are talking about your specialty period, Renaissance and food history in the Renaissance and material culture. Please go ahead.
Yeah, let me put the sort of fasting in greater context, because I think that's the way that not just the fact that people, eat fish on Fridays. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. There's also the feasting side of it that's embedded in Christianity. But as you probably know, when Christianity was first formed, it was consciously in contradiction to Judaic food prohibitions. They said, everything is okay to eat. There's a dream that Peter has where there's this big net teeming with animals, and God says, rise up, Peter, kill and eat. And he goes, okay, I'll eat everything. And so, but the one thing that is not taken away are the fasting rules. And in fact, like a good Jew, Jesus fasted and his apostles fasted 40 days, that's pretty heroic feat. And so the idea behind fasting was not that you would do it on a particular day, as in Judaism, it's Yom Kippur, but rather that you would do it as an act of atonement, that when you sinned, you would show God, I'm really, really serious. I'm never going to do this again, and stop eating and put sackcloth on and ashes on your head and be penitent to show that you were serious. And that, of course, is taken to great extremes among ascetic people who think, their whole lives should be an act of permanent penitence and imitation of Christ. But the church really didn't have any food rules until about the time of Tertullian, 3rd, 4th centuries, when they start to come in, that they decided, oh, well, we will fast in remembrance of Christ's 40-day fast, and we'll fast every Saturday. That includes the Friday night before, and we will fast Wednesday in some places. And the idea of fasting, they thought, well, people can't stop eating entirely, but let's put meat and dairy products and eggs in, for meat days, and let's make fasting days only fish or vegetables. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were austere. They were actually sometimes very, very opulent meals of extravagant fish, including whales. Whales are okay for fasting, and great wines. And that's a big sort of a contradiction of the whole idea of being penitent. And then you go and have this luscious meal, which one thing reformers actually accuse them of doing. But the importance of that is not just that you had two very different menus, and those show up in cookbooks, from the earliest medieval cookbooks all the way through ultimately until 1964, really. Not everyone continued to fast, but logically in people's minds, you separated meat dishes from fish dishes, and vegetables are sort of, they can go either way. You can cook a vegetable in oil or in pancetta or butter, but it's almost inconceivable, and you will know this as Italians, to put fish with cheese. Why? Because it breaks that fast, right? It's just a logical inconsistency in the minds of Italian gastronomy in a way that they would do it elsewhere. You'd put France doesn't really count. France has its own culinary logic. But I think what is interesting is that though medieval diners always kept fish and meat separate, and eggs and cheese go on the meat side, and dairy goes on the meat side, is that the whole question is opened up in the Reformation. And then they're saying, well, look, Jesus didn't fast like that. He did it to atone. They did it publicly. In fact, sometimes they had public fasts when, before a war or, for some emergency, not a very specific day. So in the long run, what happens is all the Reformed churches, of course, abandon fasting in the long run. England tries to hold on to it for a very long time, but Protestant countries abandon fasting. And in reaction, and as much of what happens in the Council of Trent is intentionally the opposite of what the reformers do, they stress fasting again, and they stress the importance of, the theatricality of the church. The whole Baroque era is magnificent, and of course that includes the dining practices of all of Lent fasting, the Quattro Tempori, which are these 4 days spread through the calendar, and vigils of saints' days, and that of course includes before Christmas also is the fishes, eating fish those days. What is really interesting though is that there's a Catholic. Let me just give you one little quote, and I'll turn it over. Is this guy Jeremiah Drexel, who wrote this book called Aloe Amari, meaning bitter aloes, the benefits of fasting. He argued that it actually has a gastronomic importance. If you're always eating really rich food, you kind of blow out your taste buds. You can't taste really delicate things. And he said that fasting regularly sort of reanimates your ability to taste, so that very, very simple foods can suddenly be wonderfully delicious. So he's making a gastronomic argument for fasting. And I think he's absolutely right, is that, if you eat Doritos every day, you can't taste anything ever again. Okay, so I think that's my 5 minutes, isn't it?
I want to continue with this idea of fasting with Luigi. In your studies, especially of the Last Supper, that's something I know that you have dedicated a lot of study to. It's an interesting balance, because the Last Supper, it's a ritual supper, but that follows some of the Judaic prescriptions, but then Jesus brings in new things, and there is a meat that is conspicuously absent from the table, that is the lamb, but you found other stuff in the diet of the Last Supper.
Yes. Well,
from your observation of paintings, and we mentioned here that you're a poet and a literary critic, but you also have a very keen eye on the visual representations of food in time.
Well, yes, but you see, the Last Supper, to begin with, there is a controversy. We have to decide whether the Last Supper was a Seder or not. And of course, according to the Synoptic Gospels, it is, but according to John, it isn't. And so Pope Benedict, in his book on Jesus of Nazareth, sides with John against the idea of coupling the Last Supper with the Jewish Seder. But whether it is a Seder or not, it remains a Jewish meal. So the idea of putting on the table food that is not kosher constitutes a problem no matter what. And we have a very important essay written by Cardinal Federico Borromeo, the Pictura Sacra. That's, of course, in the wake of the Council of Trent. So we are into Counter-Reformation, in which the cardinal says that no lamb must be drawn, must be pictured in the Last Supper, because the lamb is Christ himself. And he quotes from St. Paul, from a letter to the Corinthians, in which Paul says, Christ is our Easter, is our Pascha, and therefore there's no need for a lamb. And in fact, he says painters should only paint bread and wine, and that would be it. And in fact, he's an iconological master, because if you go back to the frescoes of the Cenacoli of Florence, or even Giotto at the Cappella di Scrovegni, there's hardly anything on the table. But after 1417, my God, all kinds of food arrives. You name it. There's, in fact, you are in Mantua, you should go and see the Museo Diocesano, the Diocesan Museum of Mantua. There's a huge painting, and right in front of Christ, there are 2 huge sledges of Parmigiano Reggiano. Now imagine. So, I mean, this is one example, but you go, for instance, old Tintoretto painted 7 Last Suppers. There are beautiful loaves of bread everywhere and all kinds of food, Veronese, you name it. And of course, Leonardo, who decided to put right in front of, on the table, 2 dishes of eels. Now, that's one thing that is absolutely prohibited. And according to the Leviticus, and all fish without scale and without fins are impure. So I think that this is due to the fact that, as Ken was mentioning before, Jesus was rather tolerant when it came to food, and he mentioned the great episode of Peter being told by God that he can eat impure food, which means that food that the Pharisees and other sect was so keen on prohibiting was really not the representative of the issue of religion, but rather a formality. And there are several. To begin with, Christ is banqueting all the time. In the Gospel of Luke, you have 12 times when he's eating with sinners and publicans and God knows what. And he says, of course, this is a great opportunity where the doctor must tend those who are sick, not those who are healthy. Or even when the apostles are eating on Saturday, on Sabbath, I should say, they say, well, they're probably hungry, and it's not. And then eventually there is the great quote from actually it's not in the Gospel of, as we know, but it's an insertion, an extrapolation by Jerome, but it's beautiful. It says it's not goes into the mouth that defiles a man, food, but what comes out of it, words. I mean, it's a stroke of genius on the part of Jerome. Whether Christ said it or not, it doesn't really matter. It's very important because it's very Christian. It's in that line of thinking. And so the painters had a ball, and I have to say that when the Council of Trent strikes, there are a few attempts at sort of curbing the amount and the quality of food, but then the Last Supper becomes less frequented. In other words, as a topic for painterly activity, it sort of fades out, and you get into still lives and so on and so forth. And in the north of Europe, of course, you don't have all this. You have always Christ with a wafer, or it's already the Holy Mass. But in throughout the 1400, the second half of the 1400 and the 1500, I mean, it's always a feast. Everyone knows the house, the dinner at the House of Levi in Venice, which had to be recalled. It had to be renamed Dinner at the House of Levi because the Inquisition found it preposterous to call it the Last Supper because of the amount of food and drinks and people. It's a full banquet. Ken knows about it very well. And so they said, look, they said to Paolo Veronese, all right, we will not prosecute you, but you change the name of the painting, which he did. And everyone knows that it is a Last Supper in the mind of Veronese, although it's called the House of Levi. Recently, by the way, there was a scholar, a Venetian scholar, who reread the whole thing, and she also found out that, she also discovered that, in fact, the main dish is actually lamb, and that Peter is quartering it with a knife, and she takes these two back to the Leviticus because she makes a connection of Peter's activity with the activity described in the Leviticus by the priest, by the sacerdotes of the Jews in the desert. So yes, I mean that's an endless. It's feast for your eyes, and for your stomach.
Yeah, can I add to that? There's a wonderful little book, De Reclining, by this guy. I think it's Pedro Chacon writes it, where he says clearly Passover is a Seder. I mean, he was arguing that it was, and that's why they're reclining, like
Yes.
good ancient people would have done. It's why they drink 4 glasses of wine and they're all drunk outside in the park, in the garden afterwards. And he makes a very
They're singing.
great, good argument that of course this is a Passover, and
Yes.
and that and his argument is that when people depict it, they put them at tables. It makes no sense. And it's why people are wondering, why is John asleep on Jesus's, why did he fall asleep there? And everyone has trouble painting that, because if you're sitting at a table, falling asleep on someone is hard,
That's right. Well, except for Leonardo, nobody is not asleep at all. But I mean, normally he is, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there are very few in the mosaics. You find early mosaics, Byzantine mosaics. You find them reclining, usually around the stibadium. There is a round table with food on it, and everyone is around it, and they reach with their hand, but they're all reclining, and on the left, you see Christ, and on the last one, you see the Judas, usually, the farthest away from Christ. But that's also an interesting thing. Where is Judas in all these paintings?
Yeah.
Usually he sits across from the table, and occasionally does not. And Leonardo, of course, puts him together with the rest of the crowd. But it's a very good point that Ken is making, that is, the reclining is lost because of these rectangular Renaissance tables.
Right.
They have nothing to do with the Roman meals or with the Jewish meal in Roman times.
And I want to continue with some of you, both of you actually mentioned the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation as a sort of a turning point. But when it comes to food and to the dietetic prescriptions of the church, was it as it's considered normally for everything else, just un colpo di chiave, like they locked down everything and they crystallized things as they were? Or can we see something else happening with the Council of Trent and after the Reformation when it comes to food? Like, dietary prescriptions or dietary habits are more strictly enforced? Are they allowed to be adapted to the different geographic situations in which the church by then was present? And Ken mentioned the quattro tempora, that, as we know, is the etymology of tempura, the Japanese fried dish, and it's a name that the Jesuits gave to that kind of dish. And of course, that's a direct consequence of the Counter-Reformation. So I wanted to know what happens. Is that a turning point as much as the councils that Luigi mentioned in 1417 to resolve the issue of the three popes when it comes to food? And if so, in which way?
Can I suggest
Sure.
that it's a very brief turning point? There's for one generation or so, in the wake of the Council of Trent, and especially under the influence of Pius V, who's Saint Pius V, there's sobriety in the Vatican to such an extent that I think Scappi retired because of that. I think Pius
right.
came in. Bartolomeo Scappi, who wrote the great, the best Italian cookbook ever written, he disappears. He goes to Demenza. He's from way up in the north. And I think that's why the book was published in Venice by Tramezzino, because in Rome was a bigger, just as important a publishing center. He doesn't have it published there, and I'm almost certain that he didn't even overlook the publication, because the illustrations don't actually match what's in the book. There's illustrations of things that are not mentioned in the book, which is kind of weird. So in any case, that sobriety lasts, I think, through about the end of the 16th century. By the time you get to the 17th and the Baroque, it's out the window. It's the era, the era of unbelievably lavish banquets.
Luigi, your take on the influence of
the postcard. I'm sorry.
Luigi, your take on the influence of the Council of Trent. This was it really such short-lived? Sobriety.
I think Ken is absolutely right. The poor Scappi wrote over 1,000 recipes in his opera. He actually instructed an apprentice at the request of a cardinal, blah blah blah. I mean, the whole thing in the introduction to this book, you see, is saying that he does this so that when he dies, someone will be able to continue master of cooking, and Pius seems to be sort of dampening that enthusiasm, but for a very brief time, because then after that you have another plethora of cookbooks that come out of Italy, all the way to, I would say, until the cuisinier Francois comes along, the Italian continue to produce enormously beautiful Panunto and Stefani and so on. A number of cookbooks which contradicts the tenets of the Council of Trent. I don't know about certainly the idea of fish was a great opportunity for master cooks to turn what was supposed to be a sacrifice into an orgy. I mean, they turned his eels and tenches and all kinds of. I mean, in fact, it's very interesting to see the number of recipes that in classic cookbooks like Maestro Martino, the Libro de Arte Culinaria, they were very, I mean, he doesn't like fish very much, and he says so. And Platina too, every once in a while, he says, this dish was a favorite of, but it isn't that good. And then fish becomes, in this copy, there are pages and pages and pages of fish, because it's fasting, all right, but I don't mind fasting that way myself. It's such a masterpiece of taste and sauces and addobbi, as they call them. Right. Just which are the nostri intingoli, to enhance the flavor of all kinds of fish. So it's far from fasting, really.
Right. And what's also very interesting, I think, is that the sauces, because people have been in the habit of mind of not using animal products on fish days, is you really don't see fish in cream sauce or with butter. That's a very, very French kind of idea. And of course, Italian cuisine is influenced by the French once you get to the 18th century. But in the 17th century books, even I would say as far up into Vincenzo Corrado, you just don't see butter mixed with fish. It's just the habit of keeping them separate.
Yeah, it's always olio, scritto with a G. Right. Olio d'olive.
And my other question regarding the Counter-Reformation is that, the church aspires to be universal, and it's struggling with enculturation, the idea of adapting to the local circumstances. How is that visible in food culture? Does it impose certain diets, certain foods? Does it absorb foods that come from other cultures? How does it negotiate the universality, the Catholicity of the church with the local traditions of the different countries in which it is, that at that point are really all over the world?
I would say
universal or local?
With great difficulty. Let me give you a weird example. It's if you look at Macanese cooking, when the Portuguese showed up to China and built a cathedral with Chinese symbols on it, which is really amazing, in Macau. There's no, in Chinese cooking, of course, you use pork fat, you use pork, you mix it with vegetables, there's no separation. They don't have dairy so much, but the idea of eating meat with fish is perfectly fine. They don't separate them as European cuisine does. And I think that they had a great difficulty, obviously Christianity didn't win over the masses there. My guess is that that the food culture was just not this. It was so different that the dishes that survive are really just little relics of Portuguese cooking that stay among that community. They don't really influence. The other example would be Japan, where they do the Portuguese leave, they're kicked out, and the Jesuits also are kicked out. But what the Japanese keep are all their cakes. They keep the kazutera and you mentioned tempura, which is the exact same period. Made me think of it, but they're not. They're there's no worry about mixing meat into fast days, because obviously they don't fast after that, so they just adopt them and they keep them in the cuisine.
But even before the Council of Trent, the idea of putting on the table what people ate, or probably is not alien to the diffusion of Christianity. If you go to Elsinore in Denmark, there, there's a Last Supper on the cupola that has right in front of Christ the head of a pig, actually of a wild pig, with a fang sticking out. So I mean, the idea of eating pork meat, or you know, it's a boar. I mean, if you go but then in South America, in Cusco, you have another very famous Last Supper, and there are pigs there too. I mean, they are guinea pigs. They are the little pigs of the Andes. So the church before and after was very accommodating, I would say. You know, it depends on what you had to do in order to grab the attention of your audience. The idea of making Christ eat what you eat was a success. And in fact, but even before, as I said, the Council of Trent, and in fact, it was there before, and the Council of Trent did not interfere that much on it, as far as I know. You know, throughout the Alpine regions, you have hundreds of Last Suppers with crayfish. It's another no-no. I mean, you know, it's a gamberi di fiume. I mean, just where do they come from? Why? Because that was a staple. You know, nowadays they're very rare, but in those in the 1400, in 1500, you would have thousands of them in each rivulet, in each stream, and they're delicious, and so they end up on the table as well. I mean, there are many indications that they were actually invited. The painters were instructed to do so. I don't know. There's a great book by a fellow we don't know much about him, called Johannes de Caulibus, who is the imitations of the life of Christ. And when he goes to describe what happens after the fasting, after Christ's fasting, the angels arrive and they say, "What would you like to eat?" And Christ says, "What my mother's cooking right now at Nazareth." And the angels go to Nazareth and they lift up whatever she's cooking for Joseph on top of everything else, and they bring it to the Lord, you know, and they lay down, they have a colazione al fresco. And all this is, of course, a book that would be in the hands of preachers. The author was a Franciscan, not necessarily a Dominican, but in any case, this kind of literature was in the hand of priests who would use it to speak, to humanize very, very serious issues, you know, like the transubstantiation. I mean, what would possibly one understand of the fact that a piece of bread is also the body of God? I mean, you know, just mind-blowing. But if you tell him, hey, wait a minute, you know, he was eating fish cooked by Mary, that's much better, you know, much easier to get.
There are also these weird sort of gastronomic miracles that occur when people get fed by the host and angels present it to them, and it's the most wonderful taste. That there's this one saint who's I can't remember his name now, but he's all hairy. He looks like the Cookie Monster, and there's always like an angel presenting, you know, the cookie to him, and he lives just on that, you know. And there's so there's a very odd sort of gastronomical side to eating Christ's flesh. Let's put it that way, because it is nourishing.
I have a question for both of you, since my duty is also to follow in the path that Gianfranco and our friends at Gruppo Italiano wanted, that is to talk also about Italian food. And of course, we talk here about Italian food a lot, but in a very global perspective, as it should be. But I just want to ask you a very personal question to each of you. What is your favorite Italian food that is related or connected to some religious tradition, a saint's cult, or what is the weirdest story you can tell us about one of these food? One for each of you.
Okay. Unfortunately, my favorite food is pasta, and it didn't exist in Palestine at the time. No, I don't know. I certainly would appreciate uh, um, I don't know. It's a question I was unprepared to answer, so I have to think about it for a second.
Okay, well,
Uh,
I'll jump in then. There's an Italian American festival or tradition, culinary tradition. It's not apparently in Italy, people don't know of this, but it's called the Feast of Seven Fishes. And in the US, before Christmas, you make 7 different fish dishes. And I always just love that idea. I don't know why and so every time I write another cookbook, I try to incorporate the Feast of Seven Fishes in some way. So I did a noodle soup book. I did 7 different fishes in a noodle soup. I did a Jello book just recently. There's 7 different fishes in the Jello, which is crazy. And I'm writing right now a breakfast book. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get 7 fishes in for breakfast? That's the big thing that's stumping me now.
Well,
that's one of the debated issues in Italian-American culture. Whether the 7 fishes is really Italian or is it an Italian-American thing. There was a long article, I believe also last year in the New York Times about that.
So, yeah.
Yes,
with research about it. And it's, is it really, and apparently there is some remote part of Italy in which the feast is celebrated in that way. But the jury is still completely out, from what I understand. And while Luigi thinks about his favorite one, I'm going to tell you my favorite one. It's not from Mantovado. It's from Florence.
No, I'll tell you.
And it's pan di ramerino. Have you ever had pan di ramerino?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Pan di ramerino. It's a Florentine bread that originally it was baked only on Monday, Thursday, on Holy Thursday. And it's a theological treatise in itself, because it's made with flour, like the host, the bread, olive oil that reminds you all the sacraments that employ an anointment, like the anointment of the sick or the ordination. And then there is rosemary, that of course is an evergreen, and therefore it's a prefiguration of the resurrection. And then of course there is raisins, grapes, that with flour is the symbol of the Eucharist. So it's basically a treatise about the 7 sacraments in a little loaf of bread that is simply delicious. And fortunately now bakers are also baking it throughout the year. Before, if you ask for pan di ramerino outside of Holy Week, they would look at you and say, where are you from? That's pan di ramerino, it's on your Good Thursday. Now you find it all the time. Marketing got the best part of Florentine bakers. Luigi, your favorite?
No, actually, I tell you, I will answer with a wish rather than with a reality. I would like to associate my religious meal with eels, and of course, I'm thinking of capitoni, which I never had in my life. Although my grandmother from Abruzzo made it every single Christmas Eve of her life. And for some reason, I never managed to be there at the time. So I have one wish to fulfill, but I have to find someone who does it for me. And, finding eels these days, it's not very easy. You have to go to Chinatown where they do sell them. But then again, I mean, I don't think my wife will ever touch it. So,
well, to show you my heart is Italian, maybe you can't see this picture. That's a pizza that I had made this morning.
Maybe I'll come to
with eels. Sorry, I made an eel pizza this morning. Yeah.
Fantastic.
And Luigi, I have news from you. Our Christmas Eve dinner starts with tortelli di zucca and continues with capitone, that is marinated eel, and mostarda. And now you find the marinated eel in cans, and it's actually pretty good.
Really?
I'll save a can of it, and I'll bring it over to New York.
All right, if you say so. As long as it doesn't taste like gefilte fish, I'm okay.
It really tastes very good. And if you get a good chunk, it's juicy and meaty and delicious. Thank you so much to Luigi Ballerini and Ken Albal. And I think I would like to leave the closing to our host, Gianfranco Sorrentino. Gianfranco, please.
Grazie. It was so interesting. Thank you very much to our panelists and, of course, our moderator. I want to say a story about the hills, Capitonian Anguille. Napoli is very famous for the Capitonian Anguille. And I remember when I was young, very young, 6, 7, 8 years old, I used to go to the Mercato a Porta Capuana, the fish market, with my mother, take the bus, go there on the 24th early in the morning, and buy the capitone and the anguille. And they used to put in the cuopo, which is the cone made with the paper. They put the capitone anguille, they close and give it to you. We take the bus, and you can see in the bus the capitonian anguille going everywhere and catching the capitonian anguille under the seats, under the chairs. Then that's not finished yet. Then you go home, put the capitone in the refrigerator. Then when you take out the capitone anguille is going everywhere, then you carry it, you put in the padella to fry, and you can see the pieces of capitone still moving and jumping out. There is now a joke that they say that De Luca said that no more than 4 people can be home for Christmas. But in Naples, they said that you need 6 people to fry the capitone and the anguilla. So that would be anyway, I don't know if we have any questions from our viewers. Alberto, do we have any question?
I don't see them in the. I don't see them in the chat.
No.
Hold on. No.
No. Well, I have a question anyway.
Go ahead,
if you don't mind. For both of our panelists. I mean, we've been talking about the past, about the tradition, the religion, etc. What about the future? There are some tradition in some religion that they are stronger. I'm talking about the Catholic religion, which seems to me a little more mellow, as you said. How do you envision the future? Let's say in 20 years, in 50 years, what is going to be the evolution about the feasting, the diet, about the Catholic religion? Practically, if I want to open up a restaurant in Rome in 50 years, what shall I serve?
What a big question. Wow. Well, you know, people still eat fish on Fridays out of tradition. I think those people, that generation will be gone. I mean, those rules changed in 1964 when I was born. So I think that there won't be anyone left in 20 years who cares about fish on Friday. And I don't think anyone really does fast anymore, do they? I mean, actually do a penitential fast, for some reason. So I think if anything, life will be more pleasant. But the other thing that I think we're losing with that is that when you fast, you do feast also on the other side, and so feasts become less important if you do them every day. They're not so important.
I think you should. If you open a restaurant 50 years from now, I don't know. I mean, I'm in the same state of confusion. But I would argue that it must be heavily vegetarian. And I think more and more younger people are going in that direction. And also, of course, it doesn't have to be vegan, mind you. So I think cheese will play a great role in it. And as long as animals are treated humanely, I think that will be tolerated. And it seems to me that there is that we must take also into account. Strangely enough, thinking about the future, I would also emphasize historical recipes, because I think there is a tendency to. I mean, the idea of eating the way they ate in the past is very appealing. Naturally, some of the some of the dishes that as described by these cookbooks, Ken knows better than I, are repulsive. I mean, you can't, we were talking about Scappi's opera, and at one point he said, I think it was Messi's book, in any case, doesn't matter. He says, talking about eels, he says, and now, if this dish is for the sick, make sure you put sugar on it. So it must be sucré. Well, so imagine. However, I think that there are quite a number of recipes to be resuscitated,
yes,
those are that would be my advice.
I would agree with you 100%, except that the things that often sound revolting, in fact, they come out so good. Let me give you an example: an eel pie, just with sugar in it and cinnamon, and most people go, "What?" Even just eel. But imagine sweet eel. Very standard medieval recipe. It is so good. It's delicious.
You see, I never tried
sugar.
That's
it's beautiful. It's absolutely
so
beautiful.
It isn't that
sometimes, yeah.
It sounds repulsive, but it isn't. Does. Okay, that's great. Yeah.
And Gianfranco, if I may add something to what the colleagues were saying regarding what is the future, specifically regarding the Catholic Church. I believe that with the papacy of Francis, we are seeing these double phenomenon. On one hand, definitely he's not close to the idea of the prohibition or an hyper-regulated church that tells you do this, don't do the other one. So that kind of thing is sort of gone. But at the same time, there is that sort of environmental consciousness in the encyclicals and the awareness that, the responsibility of human beings towards all of creatures that definitely goes, as Luigi was saying, in the direction, maybe not of veganism, but of a different kind of treatment of animals. So what has been sort of set aside in terms of religious discipline might come back in as a way of being more aware of the fact that a human being occupies a central role in creation, but not the only role, and that other creatures should be respected, and also what we eat should be eaten with the consciousness that we are not the only ones who eat on this planet, and therefore if we want all to eat, there should be a different distribution of wealth. So it might not be from a dogmatic point of view, but from a raised awareness of our responsibility towards our fellow human beings and towards other creatures, that a different attitude of the Catholic Church develops towards food in general. That's my take.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Ballerini, Ken Albala, and Stefano Albertini for the insight providing for this really interesting seminar about faith and food. Buon Natale a tutti quanti, felice anno nuovo, che il 2021 ci porti tutto quello che ci hanno tolto nel 2020. Ciao.
Grazie, auguri anche a voi. Ciao.
Thank you very much. It was nice being here. Bye-bye. Bye, Ken. I'll try your eel pie. Okay.
Great. It's Messes Bugo, in fact.
Okay. Bye-bye.